Finally, in contemporary spirituality, the serpent in Genesis 3 is reinterpreted in various ways. For some, it represents the challenge of living authentically, where temptations and mistakes are part of spiritual growth. The serpent in this context is not merely a symbol of evil, but also a figure that embodies the complexity of human choices and the quest for authenticity in a world full of moral dilemmas. Others see the serpent as a symbol of transformation, reminding us of the need to abandon old habits and embrace new possibilities. In modern spirituality, the serpent is an invitation to explore the mysteries of life and seek a deeper connection with the divine, recognizing that the spiritual journey involves both dangers and opportunities. The richness and complexity of the figure of the serpent in Genesis 3 illustrate how a symbol can evolve and acquire new meanings over time, offering insights into the human condition and the profound questions that pervade existence. Thus, the serpent remains a central figure in theological and cultural reflection, a powerful symbol that continues to resonate in the collective imagination of humanity. Conversely, the promise of redemption in Genesis 3:15 can be seen as a call for an ethical globalization, promoting justice and respect for creation. In interreligious dialogue, the serpent in Genesis 3 can serve as a starting point to explore how different religious traditions understand evil, sin, and redemption. Religions share similar myths and symbols, such as Naga in Hinduism and snakes in Buddhist legends, which can enrich understanding between different faiths. This dialogue can open new perspectives on the universality of religious symbols and how different cultures and religions address central themes such as good, evil, and redemption. Postmodern theology, which questions meta-narratives and emphasizes a plurality of meanings, offers a unique perspective on the serpent in Genesis 3. Here, the serpent can be seen as a multifaceted symbol, open to multiple valid interpretations that reflect the complexities of human experience. This approach allows for greater flexibility in interpretation and opens space for various dialogues about the meaning of the serpent in contemporary spirituality, where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane are constantly re-evaluated. In the philosophy of religion, the serpent in Genesis 3 raises questions about the origin of evil and God's role in allowing temptation. Some philosophers argue that the existence of the serpent is necessary for free will, contending that evil is a condition for true freedom. Without the possibility of choosing evil, human freedom would merely be illusory, and the presence of the serpent serves to validate the genuineness of human choice. Other philosophers question how a good God allows a being like the serpent to exist and act destructively. This problem of evil, known as theodicy, continues to be debated, reflecting the depth of the biblical account and its implications for understanding divine justice, human freedom, and the purpose of suffering. Moral psychology, which examines how people make ethical decisions, may see the serpent as a symbol of moral temptations and the rationalizations people use to justify wrong choices. The story of the fall becomes an allegory of the internal struggle between desire and reason, with the serpent representing the forces that lead to temptation. This perspective helps to understand the psychological processes involved in moral decisions, highlighting how temptation and sin are often accompanied by a complex network of rational justifications that mask the true nature of actions. Anthropology, which studies human cultures and their traditions, views the serpent in Genesis 3 within the context of origin narratives across various cultures. The serpent appears in the myths of many cultures as a figure of wisdom or temptation, revealing universal patterns about how societies understand evil and sin. The presence of similar figures in the mythologies of various cultures suggests that the serpent as a symbol touches on fundamental aspects of the human condition related to transgression, forbidden knowledge, and the consequences of those actions. In the field of environmental ethics, the figure of the serpent can be seen as a symbol of ethical challenges in the relationship between humanity and nature. The narrative of the fall can be interpreted as an allegory of the loss of harmony between humans and the environment, with the serpent representing the forces that corrupt that relationship. The promise of redemption suggests a call to restore harmony and adopt sustainable practices, emphasizing human responsibility in caring for the natural world and avoiding the temptations of excessive exploitation. In Christian eschatology, which studies the end of times, the figure of the serpent is central to understanding the final battle between good and evil. In the Apocalypse, the serpent is identified as Satan, and its final defeat is described as part of Christ's triumph. Christian eschatology sees the story of salvation beginning with the fall in Genesis and culminating in the final victory over the serpent. This eschatological narrative underscores the belief in divine justice and the final restoration of creation, where evil, represented by the serpent, will be definitively defeated and the kingdom of God will be fully established. Additionally, modern theologians challenge the literal reading of Genesis, suggesting that the story of the fall is an allegory about the human condition. In this perspective, the serpent represents the internal and external forces that attempt to divert humanity from the path of truth and life. This allegorical reading is influenced by currents of thought such as liberal theology and critical hermeneutics, which seek to understand biblical texts in their historical cultural context and in relation to contemporary issues. In the 20th century, feminist theology re-evaluated the figure of the serpent and Eve in Genesis 3. Some feminist theologians view the serpent as a symbol of power and knowledge, questioning the traditional interpretation that blames Eve for the fall. They argue that the Genesis narrative has been used to justify the subjugation of women and seek to reinterpret the story, valuing Eve as a seeker of knowledge and autonomy. In this view, the serpent becomes a symbol of the struggle for independence and the right to question established authorities, offering a new perspective on the role of women in biblical history and religious tradition. The figure of the serpent has also been the subject of analysis in psychoanalysis, where it is viewed through different theoretical lenses. Sigmund Freud, for example, viewed the serpent as a phallic symbol and the story of the fall as an expression of internal conflicts between unconscious desires and the restrictions of morality and society. For Freud, the serpent's temptation represents repressed impulses seeking expression, and the act of eating the forbidden fruit as a violation of internalized prohibitions, reflecting the psychological dilemmas people face when confronting their desires and social morality. Carl Gustav Jung, one of Freud's disciples, developed a different approach, interpreting the serpent as an archetype of the collective unconscious, symbolizing the primordial and instinctive aspects of the human psyche. For Jung, the serpent is a symbol of transformation, representing the process of inner growth and change. He saw the serpent as an ambiguous figure capable of representing both wisdom and danger, reflecting the complexities of the spiritual and psychological journey of the individual. Liberation theology, a theological movement that emerged in Latin America in the 20th century, offers a new interpretation of the figure of the serpent. For this movement, which analyzes the Bible in light of social and political struggles, the serpent can be seen as a figure that challenges oppressive power structures. In this interpretation, the serpent represents the forces that seek to destabilize social injustices and liberate the oppressed. While this view contrasts with the traditional interpretation, it highlights the relevance of reading the Bible from the perspective of contemporary issues of justice and equality. This approach is influenced by a commitment to social formation and the search for a theology that responds to the needs of the marginalized. By reinterpreting the serpent as a symbol of resistance, liberation theology questions traditional narratives that associate power and knowledge with sin and rebellion, proposing instead a reading that values the struggle for justice and the emancipation of peoples. In modern popular culture, the figure of the serpent from Genesis 3 continues to appear in films, books, and other forms of media, usually symbolizing evil, deception, and seduction. However, some representations show the serpent in a more ambiguous light, as a being that challenges the established order and offers knowledge and power, reflecting the varied interpretations and complexity of this cultural symbol. Eco-theology, an approach that focuses on the relationship between religion and the environment, interprets the serpent as a symbol of domitable natural forces, reminding humanity to respect and coexist with the natural world. In this context, the serpent represents the natural limits that humanity must recognize, alerting about the dangers of trying to dominate nature irresponsibly. This ecological reading of the biblical text offers a new dimension to the understanding of the serpent, associating it with the need for balance and harmony between humanity and the environment. With globalization, the figure of the serpent can be interpreted in light of the challenges and opportunities of an interconnected world. The serpent symbolizes the temptations of power, consumption, and exploitation that accompany globalization, while the narrative of the fall serves as a warning about the consequences of following these paths without considering ethical and spiritual implications. His philosophical and theological approach provided a foundation for medieval understanding of sin and grace, where the serpent represented both external temptation and internal corruption. Medieval iconography often depicted the serpent with human characteristics, often feminine, symbolizing seduction and deceit. This representation can be seen in works like The Fall of Man by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, where the serpent is depicted with a female human body, reinforcing the association of temptation with femininity. This iconography not only reflected the theological views of the time, but also influenced cultural perceptions of the nature of sin and the role of women in the story of the fall. During the Protestant Reformation, the figure of the serpent was revisited by theologians such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, who brought new perspectives to the interpretation of Genesis 3. Luther saw the serpent as a symbol of the devil, but also emphasized the personal responsibility of Adam and Eve in their disobedience. For him, the fall was not only a result of the serpent's cunning, but also of the conscious choice of the first humans to disobey divine commands. Luther believed that the serpent was a tool used by Satan to tempt humanity, but that the fall resulted from Adam and Eve's free choice, highlighting the importance of free will. Calvin, in his commentaries on Genesis, also interpreted the serpent as a manifestation of Satan, but highlighted God's sovereignty in all events, including the fall. For Calvin, the fall was permitted by God as part of his sovereign plan, with the serpent being an instrument in divine purposes. He emphasized that although the serpent was the agent of temptation, the ultimate responsibility for the fall lay with Adam and Eve, who chose to disobey God. Both reformers also underscored the importance of the promise of redemption in Genesis 3:15, seeing it as the first declaration of God's grace for humanity. The figure of the serpent in Genesis 3 has inspired artistic and literary representations throughout history. In Renaissance art, the serpent is often depicted with human characteristics, symbolizing cunning and temptation. Works such as The Fall of Man by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel and The Temptation of Eve by Lucas Cranach the Elder highlight the serpent as a symbol of sin and corruption. These works reflect not only the theological interpretation of the serpent, but also the Renaissance view of the human condition, where the search for knowledge and the desire for transcendence are in constant tension with morality and faith. In literature, the serpent has been used as a metaphor for evil, temptation, and deceit. John Milton, in his epic Paradise Lost, portrays the serpent as the form that Satan takes to deceive Eve, reinforcing the traditional interpretation of the serpent as a symbol of the devil. Milton's poem explores the complexities of sin and the fall, with the serpent at the center of this narrative. He presents the serpent not only as an agent of corruption, but also as a tragic figure representing the fall of Satan himself and the inevitability of evil in the world. Furthermore, in modern literature, the figure of the serpent continues to be a powerful symbol, appearing in works that explore themes of morality, temptation, and human nature. Writers such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both influenced by the Christian tradition, utilized the figure of the serpent in symbolic ways in their works, reflecting on the struggle between good and evil and the consequences of temptation. In modern theological thought, the serpent of Genesis 3 continues to be debated and reinterpreted. Some scholars see the serpent as an archetypal representation of evil or chaos, a primordial force opposing divine order. This archetypal interpretation is often influenced by psychoanalytical and symbolic approaches that view the serpent as a reflection of the internal tensions in the human psyche. Others interpret the serpent as a symbol of human duality, the tension between the desire for knowledge and obedience to God. In this view, the serpent represents the part of humanity that longs for transcendence and autonomy, but in attempting to achieve these goals independent of God, falls into error and destruction. This approach engages with existential questions regarding the nature of sin, human freedom, and the consequences of moral choices. However, this potential is broken when sought independently of God. resulting in the fall. After the sin of Adam and Eve, God curses the serpent, condemning it to crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life. This curse can be interpreted as a transformation of the serpent's form, suggesting that it had a different appearance before the fall. Some rabbinic traditions suggest that the serpent had legs or even wings before being cursed, which reinforces the idea that it was once an elevated and majestic creature before its degradation. This transformation from an elevated being to a creature that crawls on the dust can be seen as a symbol of the degradation caused by sin. Similarly, humanity, which initially enjoyed innocence and communion with God, fell into a condition of separation and mortality. The transformation of the serpent, therefore, reflects the fallen state of human beings after sin, an existence marked by the loss of original glory and subjection to death and suffering. This symbolic reading of the serpent's curse offers a powerful metaphor for the human state's post-fall condition, highlighting the tragedy of separation from God and the need for redemption. However, even amid the curse, there is a promise of redemption known as the proto-evangelium. In Genesis 3:15, God declares that there will be enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring. He promises that the offspring of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, while the serpent will strike at the heel of the offspring. This passage is widely interpreted as the first prophecy about the Messiah who would come to defeat Satan and redeem humanity. In the New Testament, Jesus is depicted as the one who came to destroy the works of the devil and bring salvation to humanity. The promise that the offspring of the woman will crush the head of the serpent is seen as a reference to Christ's final victory over Satan, a victory that is fulfilled through his death and resurrection. This messianic interpretation of the proto-evangelium has been central to Christian theology, emphasizing Christ's redemptive role in salvation history and the final defeat of evil. The Church Fathers, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyons, and Tertullian, identified the serpent as a manifestation of Satan. They interpreted the fall of Adam and Eve as a cosmic event with implications for all creation, viewing the serpent as the instigator of this fall. To these theologians, the serpent represented the forces of evil that oppose God's goodness and his divine plan for humanity. Origen, one of the most influential theologians of the early church, also saw the serpent as a symbol of evil, but emphasized the allegorical and spiritual interpretation of the scriptures. He suggested that the serpent represented the principle of evil that resides within each person, a force internal that attempts to lead souls away from divine truth. This allegorical interpretation of Origen profoundly influenced biblical exegesis in subsequent centuries, contributing to a more introspective view of the struggle against sin and temptation. Additionally, Irenaeus of Lyons, in his work Against Heresies, elaborated on the idea that the serpent symbolized the cunning of the devil, who used human weakness to introduce sin into the world. He also highlighted Christ's role as the new Adam, contrasting with the first, who succumbed to temptation and brought about redemption. This typology that contrasts Adam with Christ became a central theme in Christian theology, emphasizing the restoration of humanity through divine obedience. During the Middle Ages, the serpent continued to be a central figure in Christian theology and iconography. Theologians like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas interpreted the serpent as a representation of Satan and saw the fall as the event that brought original sin to humanity. Augustine, in his work The City of God, argued that the serpent symbolized pride and arrogance that led Lucifer to rebel against God. He viewed the fall as a reflection of Satan's own fall, a cosmic event that affected not only humanity, but all of creation. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, analyzed the nature of sin and evil, interpreting the serpent as the personification of cunning and deceit that corrupts human will. For Aquinas, the serpent was not merely an external symbol of temptation, but also an internal representation of disordered passions that lead humanity away from the path of virtue. The account of Genesis 3 must be understood within the historical and cultural context of the ancient Near East, a region rich in myths and symbols. The serpent, a central figure in this narrative, has been the subject of extensive analysis and interpretation over the centuries, both by scholars and theologians. Its representation in the biblical text may have been influenced by various traditions from Mesopotamia, where these creatures were often associated with wisdom and power. A notable example is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works in humanity, which mentions a serpent that steals the plant of immortality from Gilgamesh, frustrating his quest for eternal life. This myth and other similar ones that circulated in Mesopotamia and other cultures of the Near East may have shaped the figure of the serpent in Genesis, giving it a symbolism that transcends the simple role of an animal. In this context, the serpent in Genesis 3 is not merely a reptile, it emerges as a symbol deeply rooted in the beliefs and myths of the time. Moreover, archaeological discoveries such as the Ugaritic texts found in Ras Shamra mention Lotan, a sea dragon defeated by the god Baal. The figure of Lotan, a serpentine or primordial dragon, strongly resonates with the ancient serpent mentioned in the Apocalypse, suggesting a symbolic continuity between the Near Eastern traditions and the Hebrew scriptures. This connection between Lotan and the biblical serpent reinforces the idea that the serpent in Genesis 3 should be understood as part of a rich tapestry of symbols and mythological narratives shared among Israel's neighboring cultures. The Hebrew word Nahash, used to describe the serpent in Genesis, carries meanings that go beyond the simple designation of a reptile. In Hebrew, Nahash not only refers to a serpent, but is also etymologically related to the verb nachash, which means to practice divination or enchant. This semantic link implies that the serpent in Genesis can be seen as a symbol of a corrupted wisdom, an intelligence diverted from its divine purpose and used to deceive and destroy. The association of Nahash with brilliance or radiance in later rabbinic texts suggests that the serpent possessed an attractive appearance, reinforcing its ability to seduce Eve. This brilliance may refer to the description of Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12-15, where he is called the morning star before his fall. This connection with Lucifer reinforces the traditional interpretation that the serpent in Genesis 3 can be seen as a physical manifestation of Satan, an angelic being who, in his fall, tempted humanity to follow the same path of rebellion against God. The biblical text describes the serpent as more cunning than any of the wild animals that the Lord God had made. This cunning denotes a superior intelligence, suggesting that the serpent was not merely an animal, but a supernatural figure, possibly a manifestation of a rebellious spiritual entity. In the Jewish context, the serpent is often associated with Satan, the adversary of God. However, the complete personification of Satan as an entity opposing God becomes more clearly developed in the New Testament. The Book of Enoch, for example, explores the idea of an angelic rebellion, where the fallen watchers take human wives and generate a race of giants. These watchers, angels who transgress divine commands, reflect a continuity in Jewish thought regarding corruption and fall, themes that resonate with the story of the serpent in Genesis. The serpent in Genesis 3 personifies temptation, deceit, and rebellion against God. The act of eating the forbidden fruit, encouraged by the serpent, represents human disobedience and the desire to be like God, knowing good and evil. This initial sin can be seen as a reflection of human pride and the desire for autonomy, which ultimately leads to separation from God and destruction. This act of disobedience can also be interpreted as a moment of existential crisis, where the human being, by choosing to follow his own will over the divine will, experiences the loss of innocence and the beginning of a journey of suffering and mortality. The serpent, in this context, symbolizes the duality of human nature. On one side, it crawls in the dust, representing the earthly and low part of humanity. On the other, its cunning and brilliance suggest the potential for knowledge and spiritual enlightenment.